Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Despite the massive death toll and sheer magnitude of the confrontation, the Second Sino-Japanese War is often treated as a shadow conflict, a chapter pressed between the European blitzkrieg and the Pacific island hopping campaigns. To the Western eye, it is an obscure war in a distant land. Yet for China and Japan, it was nothing less than an apocalypse, a crucible that would decide the fate of two nations and alter the balance of the 20th century. This war was not simply a side theater of World War II. It was the blood-soaked stage on which the future of China was hammered into shape. The communist victory in 1949, the event that gave birth to the People's Republic and defined global geopolitics for decades, cannot be understood without tracing the battles, atrocities, and betrayals of this earlier conflict. In truth, the Second Sino-Japanese War was as decisive for Asia as the Normandy landings were for Europe. But here lies the paradox. Millions perished, entire cities burned, yet this war rarely commands the same place in memory as Dunkirk or Midway. Why? In part, because the world prefers simpler stories. Heroes, villains, victories neatly packaged. The Sino-Japanese struggle was anything but neat. It was prolonged, bloody, fragmented, fought across a landscape of famine, warlord politics, and ideological strife. Its complexity resists simplification, and so it slips into obscurity. Still, to understand the precarious situation that led up to this conflict, one must look backward, far into the 19th century. China, the so-called Middle Kingdom, once the envy of the world, entered a century of humiliation, an age of internal division and foreign domination. Western gunboats forced open her harbors, carved spheres of influence, and flooded the empire with opium. Civil wars, uprisings, and the slow decay of the Qing dynasty fractured the once mighty realm. By the time the First World War had ended in Europe, China was already a country of broken loyalties. Warlords carved their names into the provinces, foreign powers extracted concessions, and a fragile republic tried desperately to hold the nation together. Rising nationalist sentiments swept through students, peasants, and intellectuals. The old imperial order collapsed in 1911, replaced by an untested experiment, a republic led by the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party. But in truth, China was less a republic than a shattered mosaic of factions, loyalties, and dreams of rebirth. It is from this storm of ambition and disintegration that the war with Japan would emerge. The confrontation between these two nations, one ancient empire turned fragile republic, the other a once isolated island forged into a modern militaristic state, was not inevitable, but it was set on a collision course by the weight of history. Japan's rise and China's decline made the clash unavoidable. Both nations were bound by a bitter irony. They looked at one another and saw not just an enemy, but a mirror. Japan saw in China a warning of what stagnation and weakness might bring. China saw in Japan a reminder of what it had failed to become, a modernized, united state. Thus, when the gunfire crackled on the Marco Polo Bridge in July of 1937, it was not simply a border skirmish. It was the ignition of decades of suppressed tensions, the spark that would unleash an inferno across East Asia. The Second Sino-Japanese War was not merely about territory. It was about survival, pride, and the soul of nations. For China, it was the chance to prove it still had the strength to endure. For Japan, it was the pursuit of empire, destiny, and resources to fuel its modern machine. For the world, it became an overlooked struggle, yet one whose consequences would ripple through history. This is the story of how two civilizations collided in blood and fire. It is a story of forgotten heroism, unspeakable cruelty, and the reshaping of Asia itself. To understand why China entered the Second Sino-Japanese War already fractured and vulnerable, one must first trace the arc of its decline in the 19th century, a decline so steep and humiliating that Chinese historians still call it the century of humiliation. For centuries, China had imagined itself the Middle Kingdom, a civilization so advanced and enduring that foreign visitors were seen as little more than tributary barbarians. Yet by the 1800s, the balance of power shifted. Western gunboats, armed with steel hulls and cannons forged by the Industrial Revolution, forced China into submission. The Opium Wars cracked open the empire, prying away Hong Kong and scattering concessions like breadcrumbs across its coast. The once proud Qing dynasty staggered under the blows. Inside, rebellion brewed. The Taiping Rebellion, fueled by religious fervor and desperation, killed more than 20 million, making it deadlier than even World War I. Provincial governors raised private armies. Warlordism became a way of life. When famine struck, peasants turned to secret societies for protection. To be a villager in this age was to live with uncertainty. Today's ruler might be a Qing general, tomorrow's a rebel warlord. By the dawn of the 20th century, the empire resembled less a nation than a crumbling edifice. Corruption rotted the Qing court. Empress dowagers schemed while reformists begged for modernization. Foreign merchants extracted wealth, missionaries claimed souls, and Japanese advisors whispered promises of industrial strength that China seemed incapable of achieving. Then came the fateful year of 1911. A coalition of revolutionaries and reformers finally toppled the Qing, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. In its place stood the Republic of China, led by the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. At last, a chance for rebirth. Yet this new republic was fragile, born of lofty ideals but bound by little real unity. The Kuomintang's founding father, Sun Yat-sen, dreamed of national rejuvenation, democracy, livelihood, and unity. But when he died in 1925, China was far from united. His death left a vacuum that ambitious generals and provincial strongmen were eager to fill. The dream of a strong republic dissolved into reality. China fractured into competing fiefdoms. Railroads became borders, and the sound of artillery replaced the voice of governance. By the 1920s, China had split into two faces. On one side, modern cities like Shanghai or Guangzhou, humming with trade, neon lights, and foreign concessions. On the other, the countryside, home to hundreds of millions, still locked in cycles of poverty, tradition, and warlord taxation. It was this imbalance that would shape the coming decades. For the peasants, daily survival mattered more than any flag flying in the capital. For the elites, ideology and ambition mattered more than bread. Foreign powers, sensing weakness, deepened their grip. The British held Hong Kong and controlled trade. The French carved out Indochina. Russia eyed the north. And in the east, across the sea, Japan watched like a hawk. While the Western empires sought profit, Japan sought something else, dominance. Amid this storm of invasion and betrayal, a new force began to stir: nationalism. University students in Beijing rioted in 1919 during the May 4th movement, protesting foreign treaties and demanding a China that could stand on its own feet. Intellectuals began experimenting with radical ideas: socialism, Marxism, Leninism. From these discussions would emerge the Communist Party of China, still small, but destined to grow. Thus, by the eve of the 1920s, China was a paradox. It was no longer an empire, not yet a republic, and barely a nation. It was a land of promise and despair, of slogans and starvation, of modern cities glowing with electric lights while villages starved by candlelight. This was the broken foundation upon which men like Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong would attempt to build their vision of the future. It is important to grasp this moment because without it, the later clash with Japan makes little sense. China did not enter that war as a united nation ready to defend its borders. It entered as a fractured body, barely stitched together, bleeding from within. Japan would exploit every wound, every division, and every weakness. When Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, China's fragile republic faced a dangerous void. His successor would need to unify a nation of fractured loyalties, rival warlords, and foreign occupiers. Into this chaos stepped Chiang Kai-shek, a man as brilliant as he was ruthless, as pragmatic as he was ambitious. Chiang was no stranger to hardship. Born into modest means, he trained in Japan, absorbing both military tactics and the fervent nationalism that surged through Tokyo's streets. He saw firsthand how Japan had modernized in a matter of decades, transforming from a feudal society into a modern empire. For Chiang, Japan's example was both an inspiration and a warning. China must either reform or collapse under foreign domination. In the years following Sun's death, Chiang moved with calculated precision. He assumed command of the National Revolutionary Army and launched the Northern Expedition in 1926, a campaign to crush warlords and stitch China back into a single fabric. The march was grueling but successful. Province after province fell in line, sometimes through negotiation, often through force. By 1928, Chiang had established his government in Nanjing, proclaiming a new era of Chinese unity. Yet unity was more illusion than reality. Many warlords submitted only in name, ruling their provinces as semi-independent fiefdoms while pledging loyalty to Nanjing. Chiang's genius was in balancing these fragile alliances, rewarding compliant generals with power, threatening others into submission, and always presenting himself as the indispensable guardian of China's survival. But Chiang's vision went further than suppressing warlords. He saw a greater threat rising within his own borders: the communists. Since 1921, the Chinese Communist Party had been growing quietly, cultivating influence among peasants and workers, promising land reform and revolution. At first, the communists worked in alliance with the nationalists, both parties united by hatred of foreign imperialism. But once Chiang secured his foothold in power, he turned on them without hesitation. In 1927, Chiang unleashed what would become known as the White Terror. In Shanghai, his forces massacred thousands of suspected communists, union members, and leftist sympathizers. The fragile alliance between nationalists and communists shattered overnight, plunging China into a bitter civil war. Villages became battlegrounds, peasants were forced to choose allegiances, and blood flowed not from foreign invasion, but from Chinese fighting Chinese. Chiang justified his actions as necessary for China's survival. To him, communism was an infection that would rot China from within. But to the peasants, weary of exploitation and hunger, the communist promise of land and justice sounded like salvation. Thus, as Chiang's armies pursued Mao Zedong and his ragged Red Army across the countryside, a deeper division was being carved into the soul of China, one that would outlast even the looming war with Japan. It was during this civil war that Mao's famous Long March unfolded in 1934-35, a desperate retreat across thousands of miles, in which the communists, though battered and nearly destroyed, managed to survive and consolidate their movement in the remote north. Mao would later call the Long March a seeding machine, scattering communist ideals across the countryside like grains of wheat. And indeed, the peasants remembered. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek sought to modernize China under his control. He built new railways, reformed parts of the economy, and projected the image of a strong central leader. Yet corruption thrived. His government often seemed distant from the needs of ordinary people, and his obsession with crushing communism left him blind to the storm gathering beyond China's borders. For while China bled in civil war, Japan was watching. Its generals saw a fractured nation distracted by internal strife, a nation ripe for exploitation. Chiang, brilliant as he was, had gambled everything on eradicating the communists. In doing so, he risked weakening China so severely that it might not survive what was coming next: a full-scale Japanese invasion. While China stumbled through revolution and civil war, Japan had already completed its transformation. For centuries, the island nation had been sealed away from the outside world, its shoguns enforcing a rigid isolation that preserved tradition but froze progress. Then, in 1853, American warships steamed into Edo Bay, their black hulls and thunderous cannons a message the samurai elite could not ignore. The forced opening of Japan shocked the nation into a furious reckoning: modernize or be colonized. Thus began the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when power was formally returned to the emperor. But in truth, it was less restoration than reinvention. The leaders of Meiji Japan scoured the globe for knowledge: German military systems, British naval technology, American industry, French education. Factories rose where rice fields once lay, ironclad warships floated in Japanese harbors, and railways stitched together the islands. Within a single generation, Japan had leapt from feudalism into modernity. This metamorphosis came with a price. The old samurai ideals of loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice were not discarded. They were weaponized. A new creed emerged, blending Bushido, emperor worship, and nationalism into a civic religion. Children in schools bowed to portraits of the emperor. Soldiers were taught that death in service was not only expected but glorious. To die for the emperor was the highest calling a man could achieve. Isolation had once bred humility. Modernization bred pride. By the early 20th century, Japan believed itself unique among Asian nations, a people destined to lead Asia out of Western domination. Yet this belief hardened into something more dangerous: contempt. Many Japanese came to see their neighbors, particularly China, as decadent, weak, and unworthy of independence. Ultranationalism took hold. Political assassinations became common, carried out by fanatics who believed Japan's destiny was being betrayed if expansion was delayed. Civilian politicians were increasingly sidelined by the military, who dominated policy and pushed relentlessly for conquest. The ideology that gripped Japan was both intoxicating and claustrophobic. Japan was an island nation with limited resources, yet it possessed a growing population and an ever-expanding army. To fuel its factories and feed its people, Japan needed land, raw materials, and markets. And the closest, most tempting target was China. By the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had already proven its strength on the battlefield. In the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, it crushed the Qing dynasty, seizing Taiwan and humiliating China. In 1905, Japan stunned the world by defeating Imperial Russia at Port Arthur and Tsushima, an Asian nation toppling a European empire for the first time in modern history. Each victory fed the sense that Japan was destined for greatness, that its emperor-led state was superior not only to its Asian neighbors, but to the West itself. But success bred hunger. The military believed expansion was both a right and a necessity. Japan's leaders began to envision a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an empire that would unite Asia under Japanese leadership, by persuasion if possible, but by conquest if necessary. To the outside world, this rhetoric was cloaked in talk of liberation from Western colonialism. To the people of Asia, it meant Japanese domination. Thus, while China wrestled with civil war, Japan prepared for expansion with cold determination. The collision between these two nations was inevitable. One, a fractured republic struggling for survival. The other, a modernized empire intoxicated by its own destiny. The clash would come not by accident, but by design, and it would transform the entire continent. By the closing years of the 19th century, Japan had already begun to flex the muscles it had so rapidly built. Its leaders understood that industrial strength without conquest would wither. For a nation with scarce farmland and almost no vital resources like coal or iron, expansion was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. The first great test came in 1894. Korea, long a tributary of China, had become a flashpoint of interest between the decaying Qing dynasty and the rising Japanese empire. When a rebellion broke out in Korea, both China and Japan sent troops. But Japan's soldiers were better trained, its navy modern and disciplined, its industry capable of sustaining the campaign. Within a year, China's armies, still reliant on antiquated structures, plagued by corruption and disunity, were shattered. The Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 was a humiliation for China. Taiwan was ceded to Japan. Korea was declared independent, but in practice it fell under Tokyo's shadow. For centuries, Korea had looked to China as its guardian. Now, it was Japan that called the shots. The symbolism was clear. China's mantle as the central power of East Asia had been stolen. Japan, meanwhile, tasted triumph. Victory over China was followed by another triumph a decade later, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. Against all expectations, Japanese armies crushed the Tsar's troops in Manchuria and annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European great power. This was more than military success. It was psychological revolution. Across colonized Asia, nationalists whispered that if Japan could rise, so could they. Across Europe, elites were forced to concede that Japan was no longer a backwater. It was a power to be reckoned with. Flush with confidence, Japan expanded steadily. It annexed Korea outright in 1910, transforming the peninsula into both colony and testing ground for its empire. Factories, railroads, and schools were built, but all under a system designed to erase Korean identity and feed Japan's needs. To the Japanese, Korea was proof of their ability to rule. To the Koreans, it was a bitter lesson in subjugation. Japan also turned its gaze across the Pacific and the Asian mainland. Islands in Micronesia fell under its influence after World War I, granted as mandates by the League of Nations. The Pacific Ocean, once a barrier, was becoming Japan's highway. The Japanese Navy expanded, its admirals envisioning not only dominance of Asia, but eventual challenge to the Western powers themselves. And always in the background loomed China. Japan's rulers saw China as both opportunity and danger. Opportunity because China's vast land and resources could sustain Japanese industry for generations. Danger because if China ever regained unity and modern strength, it could rival Japan's ambitions. The contrast was stark. In Tokyo, orderly boulevards, steel factories, and naval academies. In China, fractured provinces, peasants bent over fields, and warlords squabbling over scraps. The gulf between the two neighbors grew wider with each passing year. Japan, intoxicated by victories and a sense of destiny, marched confidently toward empire. China, humiliated and fragmented, watched helplessly as its former tributary, once the little brother, now dictated terms on the international stage. The stage was set for a confrontation not of equals, but of a predator circling weakened prey. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. The hunger that drove Japan to expand would soon strain its economy, stretching it beyond capacity. And when that moment came, Japan would turn its full gaze back toward China, seeking land, resources, and domination. The 1920s were a decade of hunger in Japan, not only for pride, but for survival. Industrial growth had created vast cities and a swelling population, yet the islands could not feed themselves. Rice had to be imported, and coal and iron were never enough. Japan's leaders looked across the sea at Manchuria, a region of northeast China rich in farmland, timber, and minerals. To them, Manchuria was not just a neighbor, it was the answer to Japan's future. The spark came in September 1931. Near Mukden, along a stretch of the South Manchurian Railway operated by Japan, an explosion rocked the tracks. The damage was minimal, a section of rail torn up but quickly repairable, yet the Japanese military declared the blast an act of Chinese sabotage. In truth, it was almost certainly staged by Japanese officers themselves, a pretext carefully engineered to justify invasion. Despite Tokyo's civilian government ordering restraint, the Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria acted on its own. Within days, Japanese troops swept through Manchurian cities with ruthless efficiency. Armored trains carried soldiers across the countryside, airplanes strafed resistance from above, and local Chinese forces, fractured, ill-equipped, and under conflicting commands, were overwhelmed. By February 1932, the entire region of Manchuria had fallen under Japanese control. The conquest did not stop at occupation. Japan declared Manchuria a new, independent state, Manchukuo. To give it an air of legitimacy, the Japanese installed a puppet ruler, the last emperor of China, Puyi. Once the child emperor of the Qing dynasty, overthrown in 1911, Puyi now reigned again, though only in name. Real power lay with Japanese generals and businessmen, who exploited Manchuria's resources with ruthless efficiency. Factories sprang up, railroads expanded, and farmland was seized. For the Chinese people of Manchuria, life under occupation was a harsh reality. Farmers were forced from their lands, workers pressed into mines, and dissent crushed with bayonets. Japanese propaganda promised modernization and prosperity under the co-prosperity of Manchukuo, but for ordinary Chinese it meant humiliation and exploitation. The world took notice, but only faintly. China, desperate, appealed to the League of Nations. After a year-long investigation, the League concluded that Japan's invasion was unprovoked and illegal. Yet the verdict carried no weight. In response, Japan simply walked away from the League in 1933, a gesture that symbolized both defiance and the impotence of international diplomacy. It was a warning that aggression would not be checked, not in Asia, nor later in Europe. For Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government, the loss of Manchuria was a wound that cut to the bone. Yet China's response was muted. Chiang knew his armies were unprepared for direct confrontation with Japan, still embroiled as they were in the struggle against warlords and communists. So he ordered a policy of non-resistance, choosing survival over suicide. To many Chinese, it seemed cowardice. To Chiang, it was cold calculation. Better to endure humiliation than to exhaust the nation before the real war had even begun. But Japan's victory in Manchuria whetted its appetite. It had tested the world, and the world had looked away. The generals saw inaction as permission. For them, Manchuria was not the end. It was the beginning of a much larger conquest, one that would soon engulf all of China. When Japan swallowed Manchuria in 1931, the world gasped, but only for a moment. Headlines flashed across newspapers in London, Paris, and Washington, yet the outrage quickly faded into indifference. For the West, China was far away, a land they had long treated as a chessboard for concessions rather than a nation to be defended. The League of Nations, founded after the carnage of World War I to guarantee peace, became China's last hope. Chiang Kai-shek's diplomats pleaded their case in Geneva, denouncing Japan's aggression and demanding justice. After a year of investigation, the League delivered its verdict. Japan was guilty of unprovoked invasion, its puppet state of Manchukuo illegitimate. But the judgment was toothless. No sanctions followed, no troops were mobilized, no economic punishments enforced. Japan responded with contempt. Its delegation walked out of the League, never to return. The moment was a dark foreshadowing. If aggression in Asia could go unpunished, why not in Europe? Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini were watching closely. For China, the decision was devastating. The League's impotence revealed an uncomfortable truth. In the 1930s, the great powers had little interest in defending China. Britain and France were more concerned with Europe, their economies battered by the Great Depression. The United States clung to isolationism, unwilling to commit to foreign entanglements. Russia, though sympathetic, had its own anxieties about Japanese designs on Siberia. The moral failure reverberated far beyond diplomacy. To the Chinese people, it confirmed that they could rely only on themselves. To the Japanese military, it was validation. The world would not interfere with empire building. Every city taken, every railroad seized, was proof that boldness carried no consequence. Meanwhile, propaganda machines in Tokyo celebrated Manchukuo as a triumph of modern state building, a new order for Asia. Posters depicted smiling farmers and bustling factories, masking the reality of forced labor and military rule. In Chinese villages, however, the occupation was remembered differently, as a scar of betrayal, both by foreign nations who looked away and by their own government, which had chosen not to fight. Chiang Kai-shek's policy of non-resistance remained deeply controversial. His defenders argue he was playing for time, conserving China's strength for the larger struggle he knew would come. His critics claim he surrendered the nation's dignity, emboldening Japan to press deeper. Both views hold truth, but what is undeniable is this. By the mid-1930s, the balance of power in East Asia had shifted irrevocably. Japan had seized territory the size of Western Europe, rich in resources and strategic depth, and had paid no price for it. The League of Nations' failure was not just a failure for China, it was a failure for the world. It taught aggressors that international law was paper-thin. It whispered to dictators that treaties could be broken without consequence. It set the stage for the conflagration that would soon consume not just Asia, but the entire globe. By the mid-1930s, China was split in two. On one side stood Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government in Nanjing, determined to suppress all rivals and modernize China under Kuomintang control. On the other, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, battered but not destroyed after the Long March, now dug in across the northern provinces. Their rivalry was bitter, their hatred deep. Each regarded the other not as an ally, but as the gravest obstacle to China's future. But beyond these domestic struggles, a greater danger loomed. Japan's armies, emboldened by their conquest of Manchuria, now pressed further into northern China, demanding ever more concessions. By 1935, Japanese patrols roamed beyond the Great Wall, and puppet regimes sprang up in Hebei and Chahar provinces. The writing on the wall was clear. China was running out of time. Yet Chiang remained fixated on destroying the communists. He reasoned that Japan was an external threat, serious, yes, but survivable, while the communists were a mortal disease within the body of China. "The Japanese are but a disease of the skin," he is said to have remarked. "The communists are a disease of the heart." And so, even as Japanese divisions pushed deeper into Chinese territory, Chiang diverted troops to encircle Mao's base areas. This gamble nearly ended in catastrophe. In December 1936, Chiang traveled to Xi'an to supervise operations against the communists. There, in a stunning twist, he was seized by his own generals, men who had grown weary of fighting fellow Chinese while foreign invaders advanced unchecked. The Xi'an Incident, as it became known, shook the nation. After days of tense negotiations and under pressure from Zhou Enlai and other communist leaders, Chiang was forced to agree to a ceasefire. For the first time in a decade, the nationalists and communists would set aside their war to form a united front against Japan. It was an alliance born of necessity, not trust. In the mountains of Shanxi, Mao's Red Army continued to spread its message among the peasants, winning support with promises of land reform and liberation. In Nanjing, Chiang still viewed the communists with suspicion, seeing them less as partners than as rivals temporarily restrained. Both sides knew the truce was fragile, yet the symbolism mattered. For a brief moment, China presented a united face to the world. The uneasy alliance had profound consequences. For the first time, the communists gained a measure of legitimacy, recognized as co-defenders of the nation rather than outlaws. For the nationalists, the truce allowed them to redirect their armies toward Japan, though never entirely shaking the fear of betrayal from within. And for ordinary Chinese, weary of civil war, the fragile unity brought a glimmer of hope that their leaders might finally prioritize the survival of the nation. The Xi'an incident revealed something deeper as well, a shift in China's psychology. The humiliation of Manchuria and the creeping expansion of Japanese power had awakened a new urgency. Ideological division still mattered, but survival mattered more. The invasion had turned China's internal war into a temporary cold silence. Soon, when the shots rang out at Marco Polo Bridge, that silence would shatter into the roar of full-scale war. The summer of 1937 was heavy with tension. For months, Japanese forces stationed near Beijing had been conducting military exercises, their presence a daily reminder of humiliation for the Chinese garrisons who watched from the walls of nearby towns. To the people of northern China, the occupation felt like a storm cloud swelling on the horizon, dark, silent, and inevitable. On the night of July 7th, at a stone bridge outside the town of Wanping, known to Westerners as the Marco Polo Bridge, the storm finally broke. Japanese troops staged a midnight drill, their gunfire echoing through the darkness. Alarmed Chinese soldiers believed they were under attack and returned fire. In the confusion, a Japanese soldier went missing during a roll call. Commanders demanded entry into Wanping to search for him. The Chinese garrison refused. It was a small dispute, the kind that might have been resolved with words, but distrust ran too deep. The Japanese, unwilling to back down, opened fire. Within hours, the bridge was engulfed in smoke and chaos, as Chinese defenders clung desperately to the stone arches against superior Japanese weaponry. The missing soldier eventually returned, late but unharmed. Yet by then, the spark had already set the tinder ablaze. What might have remained a border skirmish escalated into full war. Reinforcements poured in. Japanese artillery shelled Wanping, while Chinese forces counterattacked with whatever strength they could muster. By July 20th, Japanese divisions had pushed beyond the bridge, bombarding Beijing itself. The ancient capital, with its imperial palaces and crowded hutongs, fell under Japanese control before the month was over. For the Japanese High Command, the conquest of northern China seemed a straightforward matter, a quick punitive campaign, a show of strength, then negotiations on their terms. But they underestimated Chiang Kai-shek. For years, he had pursued cautious policies of non-resistance. Now, with the entire nation watching, he could not afford to retreat again. To yield Beijing without a fight would mean the total collapse of nationalist credibility. So Chiang made a fateful decision. He ordered the opening of a second front, choosing Shanghai as the stage. It was a gamble born of both strategy and symbolism. Shanghai was China's largest city, a modern metropolis where Chinese pride and foreign interests converged. By striking there, Chiang hoped to prove that China would not simply roll over. But in doing so, he also guaranteed that the conflict with Japan would spiral into something far larger, far bloodier, and far more devastating than either side had imagined. The Marco Polo Bridge was not merely a battlefield, it was the point of no return. What began with a single missing soldier would expand into a war of annihilation, engulfing cities, villages, and millions of lives. Asia's century-defining conflict had begun. Chiang Kai-shek knew that the loss of Beijing, though painful, might still be explained as a tactical retreat. But if China was to rally, he needed to show both his people and the world that the nation would not yield without resistance. His answer was bold, even reckless. He would strike at Shanghai, China's most modern and international city, in the hope that defiance there would draw the world's attention. On August 13, 1937, nationalist forces launched their assault. Chinese troops stormed the Japanese concession in Shanghai, plunging the city into chaos. What followed was a battle unlike anything China had ever faced. Not skirmishes between warlords, but full-scale modern warfare fought street by street, building by building. Tanks rattled down boulevards once filled with rickshaws. Machine guns echoed through districts lined with neon signs, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Shanghai's narrow alleys and dense buildings became killing grounds, where grenades cleared rooms and bayonets decided who lived or died. For 3 months, the city became a furnace. Chinese soldiers, many of them fresh recruits with only rudimentary training, hurled themselves against the disciplined firepower of the Japanese. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed. At first, Chiang's gamble seemed to succeed. The ferocity of Chinese resistance surprised the Japanese, who had expected a quick victory. Newspapers abroad carried headlines of the struggle, and foreign journalists described scenes of heroic defiance. Chinese soldiers clinging to crumbling walls, charging machine gun nests with little more than rifles and sheer willpower. For a moment, the world was watching, but the cost was staggering. Japan poured reinforcements into the battle, landing troops south of the city in an amphibious operation that cut off Chinese defenses. The Nationalist Army fought with desperate courage, but by November, the tide could no longer be stemmed. Shanghai fell, and with it, nearly 250,000 Chinese soldiers, Chiang's best-trained divisions, were dead or captured. Japan too bled heavily, losing over 60,000 men, but its reserves and discipline gave it the advantage. For Chiang, the defeat was devastating. His elite troops, the heart of his army, were gone. Yet his strategy had not been entirely in vain. The battle had bought China precious time to relocate its government and industry deeper into the interior. It had also proved to both his people and the world that China would fight, and fight savagely, against foreign invasion. Shanghai's ruins smoldered as Chiang ordered his forces to retreat westward, toward the capital at Nanjing. The soldiers marched with exhaustion and dread, their ranks thinned by slaughter. Behind them lay a city reduced to rubble. Ahead of them, an enemy whose appetite had only grown. What awaited in Nanjing would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. When Shanghai collapsed in November 1937, the Chinese retreat was frantic and chaotic. Chiang Kai-shek ordered his battered armies to regroup in Nanjing, the capital of the Republic. Nanjing was no ordinary city. It was the heart of the nationalist government, the symbol of China's fragile unity. To abandon it without a fight would be unthinkable. To defend it was perilous. As winter set in, hastily constructed fortifications sprang up around the city. Barricades were built from sandbags and timber, trenches dug across the countryside, machine guns placed on the walls. Soldiers, weary from Shanghai's inferno, were given little time to rest before being ordered to hold their ground. Chiang promised that Nanjing would stand, but privately, he already prepared for retreat, evacuating key government officials and much of the treasury to the west. The Japanese, still stinging from the heavy casualties at Shanghai, advanced with fury. Their commanders expected Nanjing to fall swiftly, but the defenders fought bitterly. By mid-December, Japanese troops breached the southern gates. On December 12th, with the city crumbling, Chiang ordered a withdrawal. But it was too late for many of his soldiers. Thousands were trapped inside the walls, abandoned in confusion, or forced to surrender en masse. What followed remains one of the darkest atrocities in modern history. The Japanese army, frustrated by resistance and inflamed by ultranationalist indoctrination, unleashed a campaign of terror against the population. Soldiers rampaged through the streets, executing captured troops and civilians alike. Women, tens of thousands, were raped, many murdered afterwards in acts of unimaginable cruelty. Families were torn apart, neighborhoods burned, corpses piled in rivers and ditches. Estimates vary wildly, but historians place the death toll between 200,000 and 300,000. The horror was so vast that it defies precise accounting. The very scale of the massacre became part of its terror, an entire city subjected to days of systematic brutality. Survivors recalled the silence afterward, a silence broken only by the crackle of fire and the cries of the wounded. The Nanjing Massacre was not just an atrocity. It was a wound carved into the Chinese national consciousness. For decades, the memory of those weeks poisoned relations between China and Japan. Even today, it remains a point of bitter contention, with denial and minimization on one side, remembrance and grief on the other. For the world in 1937, however, Nanjing was another tragedy at a distance. Foreigners trapped in the city formed a safety zone that saved thousands, but international governments did little more than protest diplomatically. China, isolated, was left to bleed. The fall of Nanjing changed the war. It hardened Chinese resolve. Surrender was no longer an option when surrender meant annihilation. It also revealed to the world the depths of Japan's militarism, stripping away illusions that its empire could be benign. From this point forward, the Second Sino-Japanese War was no longer a series of clashes over territory. It was a struggle for survival, one that would drag on for 8 more years. After the horrors of Nanjing, the Japanese believed China's spirit would be broken. Instead, resistance only deepened. Chiang Kai-shek relocated his government westward, first to Wuhan, then eventually to the remote city of Chongqing. From this mountainous refuge, the nationalists would fight on, determined that China would not be extinguished. The war entered a new phase. Japan's armies spread across the fertile plains and great river valleys of eastern China, capturing city after city: Chuzhou, Canton, Wuhan. Each conquest was costly, requiring massive troop deployments and supplies carried over vast distances. By 1938, Japanese divisions held most of China's industrial centers and railways, but the heart of China remained defiant. Villages, mountains, and the sheer size of the land turned occupation into a nightmare. For the Chinese people, the war was less a clash of armies than a daily struggle for survival. Refugees clogged the roads, carrying what little they could. Entire families fled across provinces, abandoning ancestral homes. Hunger and disease stalked the displaced. Famine swept regions where crops were trampled by soldiers or requisitioned for armies. Civilians learned to live with terror from the skies as Japanese bombers rained destruction on cities and towns with little discrimination. Wuhan in particular became a symbol of both defiance and suffering. For months in 1938, it stood as the temporary capital and the rallying point of Chinese resistance. Japanese forces sought to crush it with overwhelming assaults, culminating in one of the largest battles of the war. Hundreds of thousands fought across plains, rivers, and villages. Though Wuhan eventually fell, the sheer scale of resistance proved that China would not collapse easily. For Japan, each victory seemed hollow. Their armies could take territory, but they could not extinguish Chinese resistance. The further they advanced, the more their supply lines stretched thin. Guerrilla fighters ambushed convoys, sabotaged railways, and harassed isolated garrisons. What had begun as a campaign of swift conquest turned into a war of attrition. Morale sagged on both sides. Chinese soldiers endured staggering casualties, often fighting with obsolete weapons against superior Japanese firepower. Yet they fought on, knowing surrender meant slaughter. Japanese troops, meanwhile, grew weary of endless campaigns in a land that seemed bottomless, against an enemy that refused to die. The world looked on uneasily. Western powers condemned Japanese aggression, but stopped short of intervention. The Soviet Union supplied arms and advisors to China, while Germany, ironically once an ally of Chiang Kai-shek, shifted toward alignment with Tokyo. Still, China endured, drawing strength not from external support, but from sheer resilience. By 1939, the war had settled into a grim equilibrium. Japan occupied much of eastern China, but could not force a decisive victory. China held the vast interior, but lacked the strength to expel the invader. Between them lay millions of civilians trapped in a landscape of destruction, famine, and fear. It was a stalemate drenched in blood, and it would only deepen as the global storm of World War II loomed ever closer. As the 1930s drew to a close, the Second Sino-Japanese War was no longer a conflict isolated to Asia. It was becoming a fault line in global politics, where the ambitions of great powers collided and reconfigured alliances in ways that would soon engulf the entire world. Chiang Kai-shek desperately sought foreign support. His government, relocated to Chongqing, sent envoys to Europe and the United States, appealing to the ideals of self-determination and international law. Yet the response was tepid. Britain and France, mired in the shadow of Hitler's rise, were unwilling to commit resources so far from home. The United States, still bound by isolationist sentiment, limited its aid to moral condemnation and modest loans. Ironically, the strongest assistance came from the Soviet Union. Though wary of both Chiang's nationalists and Mao's communists, Stalin saw Japan as a direct threat to Siberia. Soviet advisors arrived in China, helping modernize parts of the nationalist air force, while convoys of Soviet planes, tanks, and weapons streamed across Central Asia. In the skies over China, Soviet pilots flew combat missions, dueling Japanese aircraft in defense of Chinese cities. For a time, Moscow and Nanjing found themselves bound in uneasy partnership. Germany's position was more complicated. In the early years, German military advisors had played a significant role in training Chiang's forces, shaping the very divisions that fought at Shanghai. But as Hitler's Germany sought closer ties with Japan, the relationship frayed. By 1938, Berlin had largely abandoned China, favoring Tokyo as part of its anti-communist strategy. Chiang's dream of a Western alliance against Japan slipped further away. Meanwhile, Japan's own diplomacy revealed its ambitions. In 1936, it signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany, a declaration of shared hostility toward the Soviet Union. For Japanese militarists, this was more than symbolism. It was insurance, a guarantee that while they pressed deeper into China, Europe's rising fascist powers would not oppose them. But fate would soon intervene in ways no one could fully predict. In August 1939, just weeks before the outbreak of World War II in Europe, Germany shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. For Japan, which had been engaged in bloody clashes with Soviet forces along the Manchurian border, the agreement was a thunderbolt. Its German ally had embraced its greatest Asian rival. The ripples of these shifting alliances reached deep into the Chinese countryside. For Chiang Kai-shek, it meant the loss of his most important European supporter and the uncertainty of Soviet aid. For Mao Zedong and the communists, it underscored the reality that global politics could shift overnight, and that survival depended not on distant promises, but on the loyalty of peasants in their base areas. To ordinary Chinese, however, these maneuvers in faraway capitals mattered little. Their lives were measured not in treaties, but in bombs and bread. Yet the geopolitics of 1939 foreshadowed a larger truth. China's war was not just its own. It was becoming part of a global struggle, one that would soon burst beyond Asia and into every corner of the world. After the horror of Nanjing, the nationalist government needed more than survival. It needed a symbol of defiance. That symbol became Wuhan, the sprawling city on the Yangtze River that served as China's provisional capital in 1938. If Nanjing had been the heart, Wuhan was the lungs, breathing life into the resistance through its factories, railways, and strategic location. Japan knew this. Capturing Wuhan would mean crushing the new seat of Chinese power. And so, in the summer of 1938, they launched one of the largest offensives of the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops into central China. What followed was a campaign of staggering scope. Battles across rivers, villages, and mountains fought under scorching heat and monsoon rains. For Chiang Kai-shek, Wuhan was both fortress and message. He ordered his armies to defend it at all costs, deploying more than 1 million men. Many of these soldiers were poorly trained conscripts, but they fought with ferocity born of desperation. In some areas, resistance was suicidal, lines holding until annihilated, simply to buy time. Chinese engineers destroyed dikes along the Yellow River, unleashing catastrophic floods that drowned tens of thousands but slowed the Japanese advance. It was a desperate measure, showing how far China would go to resist. Inside Wuhan, the city braced for siege. Factories worked day and night to churn out ammunition. Newspapers printed fiery editorials calling for sacrifice. Civilians volunteered to dig trenches or carry supplies. Foreign journalists and observers marveled that a city under constant air raids could still pulse with determination. In the skies, Soviet pilots flying under Chinese insignia clashed with Japanese bombers, their dogfights streaking over the Yangtze. By October 1938, however, the Japanese had finally broken through. Wuhan fell, its defenses overwhelmed. The nationalist government withdrew yet again, retreating deeper into the mountainous interior to Chongqing. On the surface, it seemed another devastating loss. Yet Wuhan's defense had lasted 4 months, longer than anyone expected, and in those months, China had proved something vital. It could not be knocked out quickly. For the Japanese, the victory felt strangely hollow. Their casualties were heavy, their supply lines stretched to breaking. Each city taken seemed to bleed them more, demanding reinforcements they could scarcely afford. China, vast and stubborn, absorbed blow after blow and still fought on. Wuhan thus became a paradox. It was a defeat, but also a turning point. It showed the world and the Chinese themselves that Japan's conquest would not be easy. No matter how many cities fell, China's will to resist was not extinguished. The war had shifted. It was no longer a campaign of rapid strikes and expected surrender. It had become a long, grinding contest of endurance. And in such wars, sometimes survival itself is a kind of victory. While Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist armies fought large, bloody battles in cities and river valleys, the communists waged a different kind of war. In the northern provinces, Mao Zedong and his Red Army built their strength not through conventional campaigns, but through patience, persuasion, and guerrilla resistance. Mao understood something that Chiang often overlooked. Wars are not only won on battlefields, but in villages. For the peasant majority, the question was not ideology, but survival. Who would give them land, protect them from bandits, and stand with them against the occupier? The communists answered with simplicity. They promised rent reductions, fair treatment, and local leadership. Unlike the nationalist armies, notorious for requisitioning food and conscripting men by force, the communists sought to leave peasants with the sense that their struggle was shared. By the summer of 1940, Mao's strategy reached its dramatic peak. Under pressure from Chiang to prove their commitment to the war, the Communist 8th Route Army launched the 100 Regiments Offensive. In one coordinated strike, nearly 400,000 guerrillas attacked Japanese positions across northern China, targeting garrisons, supply depots, and especially railways. The results were staggering. Over 600 miles of railway track were torn up, bridges demolished, communication lines severed. Japanese supply lines bled, and entire regions were thrown into temporary chaos. For weeks, the guerrillas seemed to materialize everywhere, ambushing convoys, blowing up trains, retreating into the hills before reinforcements could arrive. Though the Japanese eventually counterattacked, driving the guerrillas back with brutal three-alls campaigns, kill all, burn all, loot all, the communists considered the offensive a triumph. It proved that even poorly armed peasants could shake the occupiers' hold. It won admiration among ordinary Chinese, who saw the Red Army not just as fighters, but as avengers. For Chiang Kai-shek, however, the offensive was double-edged. On the one hand, it demonstrated communist commitment to the war effort. On the other, it alarmed him. The offensive had raised the communists' profile, showcasing their ability to mobilize vast numbers of peasants and inflict real damage on Japan. In the shadow of Japanese bombs, a new question grew. When the war against Japan ended, who would hold the loyalty of China's people? the nationalists in Chongqing, or the guerrillas in the hills? For Mao, the answer was clear. Every bridge blown, every peasant fed, every story of defiance spread like wildfire strengthened the communist cause. The war against Japan was not just national survival, it was also an apprenticeship in revolution. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, Mao's movement would no longer be a fringe force hiding in caves. It would be a legitimate army, an ideology with deep roots in the soil of China, prepared to seize the future. By 1941, the Second Sino-Japanese War had entered a grim rhythm. The lightning conquests of 1937 and 1938 were over. Japan had taken China's major cities and railways, but the nation itself remained unbowed. What followed was not decisive battles, but years of grinding stalemate, where survival became both sides' greatest weapon. For Japan, the problem was one of geography and scale. China was vast, its mountains and rivers endless. Every city conquered required garrisons. Every railway seized demanded patrols. Every convoy faced ambush. Guerrilla warfare, waged by both the communists and remnants of nationalist troops, gnawed at the occupiers. Rail lines were blown up at night, convoys harassed by hidden snipers, bridges destroyed just as they were rebuilt. The Japanese could seize territory, but they could not hold its spirit. The burden fell hardest on civilians. In the occupied zones, farmers were forced to hand over their harvest to Japanese troops. Villages that harbored resistance fighters were burned to the ground. Survivors fled to the hills, carrying only what they could on their backs. In the interior, life was little easier. Refugees crowded into Chongqing, now the wartime capital, where Japanese bombers launched repeated raids, flattening entire districts. Sirens became a constant soundtrack of life. Families slept in caves or riverbanks, bracing for the next wave of fire from the skies. Despite the devastation, China endured. The relocation of government and industry to the west allowed the nationalists to maintain a functioning state, though corruption and inefficiency plagued every level. Rations were scarce, soldiers went unpaid, and yet the will to resist persisted. Chiang Kai-shek continued to appeal to the Allies, insisting that China's struggle was part of the wider war against fascism. The global conflict gradually intertwined with China's ordeal. In 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into World War II. Overnight, China was no longer fighting alone. American supplies began to flow, first across the treacherous Burma Road, later over the Himalayas in the dangerous Hump airlift. U.S. Advisors and generals like Joseph Stilwell arrived to coordinate strategy. Though friction with Chiang was constant, fueled by mistrust and conflicting priorities. Yet for all the new aid, the war within China remained brutally stagnant. Nationalist armies fought costly campaigns that achieved little, drained by shortages and plagued by desertion. Communist guerrillas, meanwhile, expanded their networks, steadily winning the loyalty of peasants through both resistance and promises of reform. The two sides, united on paper against Japan, continued to maneuver for advantage in the civil struggle they knew would resume once the foreign invader was expelled. For Japanese soldiers, the war became a slow bleed. The glory of early victories gave way to endless patrols, disease, and the weariness of fighting an enemy that seemed infinite. Letters home carried the bitterness of men who wondered why they were still in China, why victory never came. By 1944, Japan launched Operation Ichigo, its largest offensive of the war, seeking to link its occupied zones and secure supply routes. The campaign cut deep into China, inflicting enormous losses on nationalist forces. Yet even this massive effort failed to break China's resistance. The deeper Japan pushed, the more it found itself mired in a land too vast to tame. The war had become a furnace, consuming lives, resources, and hope, and still China endured. Year after year, through bombings, famine, and betrayal, the Chinese people clung to survival. It was not glorious, but it was decisive. Each month that Japan failed to force surrender brought it closer to exhaustion. By the summer of 1945, the end was finally in sight, not because China had broken Japan, but because the wider world had turned against the empire. In the Pacific, American victories rolled ever closer to the Japanese home islands. In Manchuria, the Soviets gathered for a final blow. And above it all, a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen prepared to fall from the skies. By 1945, Japan's war in China had dragged on for 8 relentless years. Its armies held vast swathes of territory, but the dream of forcing China to its knees had long evaporated. Supply lines stretched thin, morale crumbled, and the empire staggered under the weight of a war it could no longer afford. Yet still, Japan clung to its conquest. For the Chinese, survival had become its own form of victory, but liberation still seemed a distant hope. Then, in the final weeks of World War II, history accelerated with terrifying speed. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In a single blinding flash, a city of 300,000 vanished into fire and ash. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, unleashing devastation beyond anything humanity had ever witnessed. News of the bombs raced across Asia, carried on whispered reports and radio broadcasts. For Chinese civilians who had endured years of conventional bombings, the scale was almost unimaginable, entire cities obliterated in an instant. Yet even before the second bomb fell, another hammer struck. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Stalin had waited until the very last moment, honoring a promise made at Yalta. Within hours, over 1 million Soviet troops surged across the Manchurian border. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft swept aside the Japanese Kwantung Army, the same force that had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and begun this long nightmare. In less than 2 weeks, the once proud Kwantung Army ceased to exist, shattered and humiliated. For Japan's leaders, the twin shocks of nuclear annihilation and Soviet invasion made resistance impossible. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people directly, a voice they had never heard before, announcing surrender. With those words, the Second Sino-Japanese War, the longest and bloodiest conflict in modern East Asian history, came to an end. For China, the victory was bittersweet. The invader was gone, but the land lay in ruins. Tens of millions had perished through battle, massacre, famine, and displacement. Cities smoldered, countryside starved, families torn apart. The nationalists, battered but still standing, emerged as the official victors. The communists, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare and strengthened by peasant support, stood waiting in the shadows. The war had achieved what no foreign invader could. It had prepared the stage for China's own reckoning. Within a year, the fragile truce between nationalists and communists collapsed. The civil war resumed, fiercer than before, and the question of who would rule China was once again thrown into fire. Yet the legacy of the Sino-Japanese War reached far beyond China's borders. It exposed the weakness of international institutions, highlighted the brutality of imperial ambition, and left a wound in Sino-Japanese relations that endures to this day. Above all, it showed the world that endurance itself can shape destiny. China did not win by strength of arms alone. It won by refusing to die. The Second Sino-Japanese War remains one of history's great paradoxes. A conflict so vast, so bloody, and so transformative, yet still overshadowed in global memory by the thunder of tanks in Europe or the clash of fleets in the Pacific. But for China, it was the crucible that forged the nation's modern identity. 8 years of resistance against a technologically superior foe cost China an estimated 20 million lives. Entire cities were annihilated, and entire generations scarred. Yet in the ashes of that suffering, a new China emerged, more determined, more nationalistic, and more defined by the memory of survival against impossible odds. For Japan, the war left a very different legacy. The triumph of empire curdled into the shame of atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, the futility of endless campaigns, and the humiliation of defeat under nuclear fire. Even decades later, the memory of these crimes continues to cast shadows over Japan's relations with its neighbors. Globally, the war in China revealed the frailty of international institutions like the League of Nations, whose silence encouraged aggressors elsewhere. It foreshadowed the kind of total war that would soon engulf the entire world, where civilians became as much targets as soldiers. And within China itself, the war was both an ending and a beginning. It ended centuries of foreign humiliation, proving that China could endure even against overwhelming odds. But it also set the stage for the final showdown between nationalists and communists, a civil war that would determine whether China's future lay in the vision of Chiang Kai-shek or in the revolution of Mao Zedong. To study the Second Sino-Japanese War is to confront the resilience of a people, the brutality of unchecked ambition, and the silence of a world that looked away until it was too late. It is a reminder that history's most important battles are not always the ones most remembered, and that survival itself can be a kind of victory. This was the war that remade Asia, and though it may be forgotten by some, its echoes continue to shape the world we live in today.